Hello there, and welcome to the Dear Dyslexic podcast series, brought to you by Rethink Dyslexia, the podcast where we're breaking barriers and doing things differently. I'm Shay Wissell, your host, and I'm so glad you can join us. I'm a fellow neurodivergent, and I'm coming from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I live and work. And I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to all the tribes across our beautiful country and to all First Nations people listening today. Our podcast was born in 2017 out of a need to give a voice to the stories and perspectives of adults with dyslexia. And our voice has grown stronger year after year. We're now a globally listened to podcast with guests from all around the world. Join us for insightful conversations about living with dyslexia and other neurodivergences across all walks of life. Our special focus is on adult education, employment, social and emotional wellbeing, and entrepreneurship. We're excited to be bringing you this episode and invite you to like and follow us, or even better, why not leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. So let's get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Dear Dyslexic podcast show. I am thrilled today to have our guest, Monique Mitchelson, on our show. I'm just fangirling a little bit, so if people think I sound a bit strange, it's because I'm just so excited to have Monique on the show because I've been following her work and I've done quite a bit of her training around girls and women with autism and ADHD as we grow our work in this space. And she has a huge podcast following as well, so we're going to cover lots and lots of things today. So welcome to the show, Monique.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on. It's an absolute pleasure. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here and to be able to, get to info dump about lots of different fun topics. So thank you for having me.
I love that info dump. That's going to be a great session. That's what our session should be called, maybe.
Yes.
Yes. I'm going to learn lots of new things from you today. I can feel it. So you're based up in sunny Brisbane.
Yeah, based in Brisbane. Yep.
And you're a clinical psychologist and you work in the neurodivergent space.
Yeah, so I actually never really imagined that I would be working in autism and ADHD and neurodivergence. It's funny when you kind of look back on the start of your career to where you are, wherever you are now, and go, wow, there's some twists and turns there. But yeah, I kind of stumbled into it after my master's program in clinical psychology, going and working at a private practice where it specialized in autism and ADHD in kids and adults. And my two bosses at the time who supervised me for my registrar program, being a clinical psychologist, were both openly ADHDers, which was really refreshing. And I thought, oh, well, I'm working in a practice. I don't remember learning a lot about this at uni, in undergrad, or even in my master's program, apart from just very basic, stereotypical information. And I thought, I really need to learn more about this. So I went and did a training with Tony Attwood, which was one of the few trainings at the time. So this was back in, I think, 2016, 2017, on autism in women and adults, because I've always had a preference for working with adults and there really wasn't much out there. It was very child-focused at the time as well, a lot of the trainings and resources. And yeah, everything Tony said in the training just really hit home for me. And I thought, oh my goodness, I think I'm autistic. And yeah, there just wasn't really much further information out at the time about what to do with that or how to process that. A lot of the information was more about autistic men as well. So at the time, I kind of knew that my husband was likely autistic. So yeah, I didn't really have a lot to contextualize that. I didn't have connection to community. So I kind of dropped that until a few years later when it all came up again after my brother and mum got their diagnosis of ADHD. And then I started exploring my own identity again and got my autism and ADHD diagnoses at the age of 32 and maybe like 34. Yeah.
Which is based on your research and your training is the average age for a woman to be diagnosed with ADHD compared to boys that are around 8 years of age?
Yeah, it's pretty shocking, actually, the diagnosis gap there. And I do have to say, though, like, for example, my brother got his diagnosis of ADHD in his late 20s after he had found university quite challenging. And then my husband got his diagnosis of ADHD in his 50s. And for them, it was because they had the inattentive type of ADHD. They were missed. So even though, you know, they are male, they didn't have that sort of stereotypical bouncing off the wall, hyperactive, naughty kids in the class sort of stereotype. And they're both like intellectually gifted as well. And so I think they were able to kind of, you know, get through school and things like that and other challenges in a bit of a different way. So, yeah, I think like the stereotypes around both autism and ADHD and around, you know, gender as well with it actually harms everybody, not just girls and women. You know, it's just quite unhelpful.
There's so many things I want to unpack with you. Tony Attwood is an amazing leader in the autism space. I was lucky to meet him a couple of years ago before COVID when I was presenting and got a fan photo with him back then. What was that like going through? Because we hear a lot of times that parents are sitting with their children and their children get diagnosed and they're ticking all the boxes as well as their children. So what was it like for you sitting in that training and then having that aha moment?
Well, it was funny because he was talking about, you know, just all these different things that had been part of my childhood. So as a child, I wasn't as interested in, I suppose, other kids in the class. I was really more interested in animals, in buildings, reading books and characters and learning information. And when he just kind of said, like, what I guess are some of the signs of autism in girls and young women or internalized presentations as well, it just felt like all these light bulbs were going off for me and explaining, I guess, different comments that I'd had from people over the years, like, oh, you're so weird, you know, like, and just sort of not knowing what to really do or say in a lot of social situations when I was younger. So, for example, in primary school, just being completely socially oblivious and sometimes probably not even noticing that I was being picked on or bullied, you know, not even realizing that because I was in my own little world. And then when I got to high school, I started noticing, oh, this is really hard. Like, why am I going through all these different groups of friends? Why do I keep, you know, getting told I'm offending people or making social mistakes or not having the right facial expression? What's going on? And so that's where I started to get interested in psychology and trying to like go to the library and look up books on body language or, you know, how to make friends with people to try and solve that problem. And that's when I got a special interest in psychology, and that's continued on for, the last, you know, nearly, I guess, 20 years now. And
so with your ADHD diagnosis, did that come at a similar time?
That actually came afterwards because I was really focused on helping, you know, my family members through their diagnostic process. And I knew that I was autistic and was doing a deep dive into that. And it actually came as a surprise that I was likely ADHD as well. You know, for example, when I went to my psychiatrist for the first session for an ADHD assessment, after the first session, he was immediately like, yeah, you're definitely autistic, but we need to kind of investigate and see if you are also ADHD. And so for me, I feel like I definitely have the ADHD side to myself, but I feel like the autistic side has been more dominant throughout my life. But the ADHD side, I feel like, has been present when I was a child, being really loving active play. Like I remember, you know, bouncing on the trampoline for hours every day, swinging on the swings, like voraciously just reading and needing lots of stimulation and getting bored easily. And, you know, going to my mum and school holidays and going, I'm really bored. And yeah, there wasn't really as much to do back then, I suppose, as well. But yeah, I would blurt out things in the class. And when my mum and I actually went through my school reports, we were really shocked to see how much evidence there actually was in my school reports that pointed to not only being autistic, but also being ADHD. So I think it's always good to kind of go back and review that information if you have it, because you never know, what you'll find, or you're looking at it through a whole new lens.
It's really interesting you say that, because I'm going through the ADHD process at the moment, and I went back through all my school reports, and it's very evident from grade 2 I've got dyslexia and dysgraphia. But when I gave my reports to the psychologist, I said, going through my reports, you wouldn't think I had ADHD, but I was extremely a people pleaser. I hated getting into trouble. I was terrified of getting into trouble. And internally, my brain doesn't turn off. And so I always used to joke, I wish I had ADHD so I could get up and go running in the mornings, because I've never been a sports person. I was always really poorly coordinated. And so going through this process, I'm like the polar opposite, where I'm not very good at sport. I don't have that like external energy to get out. It's like trying to turn off the internal energy.
Yes. And that is a bit of a common misconception about ADHD, because the criteria in the DSM is really based around, external signs, things that are outwardly observable to others. So we can't observe unless you can actually read minds, if you're psychic in some way, I suppose. You can't really observe what a person's thinking or feeling inside. And, there's a lot of debate around the ADHD criteria, in that actually it really should more reflect, finding it hard to like self-regulate like energy, self-regulate thoughts and speed of thoughts and the multitude of streams of thoughts that someone's having at once, regulate emotions. It's not just about fidgeting and not being able to keep still. And when they've surveyed ADHD women, like across the lifespan, one of the things that consistently comes up is reporting emotional overwhelm and difficulty with regulating emotions. So feeling things really intensely, and then I think having the 10 streams of thoughts, at the one time, and constantly thinking. It's really tiring, to be honest, even though there can be brilliance that comes with that. When you're trying to go to sleep at nighttime and you have just these random like Elton John songs going through your head over and over, it's really hard to sleep and you can't turn it off.
No, you can't turn it off. And, I always thought it was so normal to have those songs running through your head all the time. Or like I reflect back now on my childhood, and I know it was always really hard for me to go to sleep, and I'd lie in bed like counting sheep or trying to count backwards. And I watched my daughter trying to go to sleep. And I think, everyone says don't overdiagnose, don't diagnose. But, we're clinicians, so it's it's natural for us to start to, unfortunately, diagnose our family. But it's really quite strong in our family, the neurodivergent thread.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I guess too, there's so many separate areas that kind of come together with neurodivergence, because I went and did a few different trainings, like did training in chronic pain, did training in sleep disorders, trauma, when I was first working as a psychologist to try and get, as much information under my belt as I could. But you don't sort of see the central thread, because so much stuff is siloed into, different categories. But when you're neurodivergent, like every cell in your body is different. How your body uses energy is different. Your neurology is different. Your wiring is different. Your sensory experience is different. And so, yeah, even things like sleep, or eating or drinking enough water, it can actually take neurodivergent people a lot more energy and effort to do those things that other people, it might be effortless and they can kind of do it without thinking, because our neurology is different. And yeah, like sleep disorders are actually much more common in both autistic and ADHD people. And that's not maybe that well known unless you go and do training in sleep disorders, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because how you got into this space was because there was a lack of information for adults, which is why I started in this space, because there was there was nothing around adulthood dyslexia, particularly in Australia. There's a lot more overseas. But going through your training and learning more about ADHD and autism, I just there's nothing that links them with dyslexia, because we know that they correlate so highly, particularly ADHD and dyslexia, but there's no research around dyslexia and sleep in adults, or if you've got co-occurring, how does that impact? And it's our hope one day that we can get that funding so that we can start to bring it up to a similar playing field for the other conditions, because we're not seeing that at the moment, or differences. I'm not sure which term you use. There's so many different terms.
Yeah, there definitely are. Some people will use the term conditions, some people will use the term differences. I personally identify as neurodivergent, developmental difference, neurodevelopmental difference, different neurology. But I also identify with the term disabled. And that's sort of term that everyone identifies with in the neurodiversity movement, and that's completely okay. But with the neurodiversity movement, it's aiming to destigmatize difference. And there is a lot of stigma around the term disability, and seeing the term disability as a negative thing. Why would you want to be, quote unquote, disabled? So I try to use that term, as a way of reclaiming it as a neutral identity. It doesn't have to be negative. It is a difference, but it has always impacted my life. Being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world, it can cause distress. It can take a lot longer to do things, and you're at more risk of burnout. And, for example, for myself, I've mainly been able to work part-time. I really haven't been able to sustain full-time work as an autistic and ADHD person without burning out. So yeah, I kind of put that out there because not a lot of psychologists and health professionals will also claim that identity. And I'm trying to destigmatize it by going, actually, yeah, disabled psychologists exist, and we do take up space, and we have a valuable, information to share and perspectives to share. But not everyone identifies with the term disabled, and that's completely fine. But I think it's good to talk about the language and explain. If you do identify with something, why is that, and have a think about it and reflect on it and talk with people about it.
Yes, it's so important. And I just this year published a paper on labels in the dyslexic community, because we hadn't had anything before, and it was really coming from that perspective of, superpower versus disability, the social model of disability, neurodivergence, how we've seen this cultural movement, but dyslexics haven't really been part of that movement in a lot of ways. And I don't usually consider myself neurodivergent and stuff as such. I just say I'm usually dyslexic, even though dysgraphia affects me a lot more. And as I'm going through this ADHD journey, I can really start to separate some of these differences now. But yes. I think I'll always lead with dyslexia, because that's just that was the only word people knew when I started talking about it, and not very well anyway.
Yeah, it can absolutely be a source of identity for people. And people will have sometimes, a lot of negative experiences or traumatic experiences from being othered, or, just the negative views about difference. But it can also be a neutral, it can be a positive identity as well. And it's really an individual's journey in how they relate to the language about them and the labels that they've been given, whether they want to reclaim them or use a different, version of language as well. But yeah, I think it's interesting too, how you're saying with dyslexia, dyslexic people might have their own community and their own preferences. When they've done research on the ADHD community tends to not prefer identity first language. They prefer I have ADHD, I have this medical condition, or it's something separate to me. Whereas the autistic community, when they've researched them, often prefer identity first language. I am autistic. You can't separate me from my autism because, it is my experience. And there's just been a new piece of research come out too that showed that autistic people are, the more they are exposed to the neurodiversity affirming movement, the more they are likely to identify with the term disabled, but not see it as a bad thing. So yeah, I think it will depend on each community. And with ADHD, there's so much negatives in the label, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You can kind of see why people maybe don't want to identify with that. Maybe there needs to be better language. Whereas with autism, we can drop the word disorder and go autistic. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I mean, with dyslexia, we can drop it's a specific learning disability is what,
Yes.
It's now classified in the DSM-5. But I think most people we speak to, they compartmentalize it a bit like ADHD is, I guess, where it's not their identity. It's part of something that's a significant challenge for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
We're seeing that big movement of a superpower over in the UK, but we don't see it as much unless you're like, if you're at the top of your career and it can't impact you anymore, that seems to be when it's okay to come out and proudly say it's helped you.
Yeah.
At Rethink Dyslexia, we are doing things differently. As a global leader in creating inclusive environments for adults with dyslexia, our commitment is to provide individuals with opportunities to live healthier, happier, and more connected lives. Through our range of tailored services, including coaching, learning and development programs, consultancy, and training, we are helping dyslexic individuals, businesses, and organisations to better understand and support their dyslexic employees. So if you're looking for insights, inspiration, and expert advice on dyslexia and how you can provide inclusive practices and environments, then head to rethinkdyslexia.com to find out more or book your free consultation today.
And that's not acknowledging, I think all of the struggle and all of the negative experiences people have had from institutions, systems that weren't set up for them. I think people mean to be helpful when they use superpower language, but it can actually be, without realizing it, a form of toxic positivity. And in psychology, we're always trying to, and this is ironic as an autistic person, because often autistic people are told that we're quite black and white thinkers and like all or nothing thinkers, but it's about trying to have a nuanced view. And it like understanding that something can be positive and negative at the same time. And there can be elements of both that are truthful. People may have been forced to need to be very creative and work around things and problem solve things if they're dyslexic, but then that it takes a big mental load and it can be very tiring and you can have lots of negative experiences. So it's not necessarily a superpower. People may not want to view it as, something extremely negative or deficit focused either. It may exist somewhere in the middle, and it's acknowledging the strengths of people, but also the cost, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And you're right. And I think when we talk about it, it's, that we've had to navigate, that we're not born with these strengths. It's most likely, not that we know research, there's not enough research to know yet, but it's most likely that because we've had to be creative or we've got to problem solve out of a situation where we don't have to disclose, like those muscles have built and are really strong because we've had to use them all the time. And so that's the analogy we try to, when we go to talk, is that, we've built those strengths because we've had to, out of necessity most likely, which then becomes a really positive trait in the workplace. If people could just get over the language and the maths challenges we might have, to be able to see those strengths that we've built over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think just acknowledging that can being resilient all the time can get really tiring. It's tiring.
That persistence we can't let go of. We can't let go of something. Yeah, it is tiring. Like I used to nap all the time before my daughter was born. And now I really struggle because I don't get to have naps on the weekend. But everyone laughs at me because I'm usually in bed at 9 o'clock and I don't get up till 7 because I need that that sleep to be able to recover and to be able to function the next day. Or my emotional regulation's gone. I don't have any.
And I think that's often the hidden cost, like particularly for people that are high masking, for women that are masking and pushing through. You don't see the hidden cost at home in the exhaustion and like the need to rest more and have more recovery time. And that's why it's important to talk about it and just sort of destigmatize it and help people understand it more. And it's interesting too, because even in the world of neurodivergence, autism gets a lot more funding and things like that than things like ADHD and, as you've mentioned, dyslexia. And it's almost like with, I guess, the more medical model and how, you know, things are framed, the bigger a quote unquote problem something is seen to be, the more funding's thrown at it. Unfortunately, a lot of the research around autism, the majority of funding really is on genetics and trying to find a cause and like a cure, rather than putting funding more towards actual services or asking autistic people what they would like in terms of having, like, what's a good quality of life for them. And you'll kind of see that reflected in, we have a national autism strategy here in Australia now after many, many years of campaigning and hard work and recognition, and that's amazing. But we still haven't heard back from the National Senate inquiry into ADHD, and we didn't actually get like a national guidelines on ADHD in Australia for health and mental health professionals until I think 2022. Like no national guidelines. And when you look at the ADHD foundations and organizations, there's not much funding and there's no hotlines or support lines, but we have a national like autism hotline. And I imagine for dyslexia, it's probably even less funding and research, and everything's quite siloed. You know, it's either autism or ADHD, not a recognition that, you know, it's actually really common now. In the last 10 years, we're understanding it's much more common to be diagnosed actually as both. And a lot of people don't have the understanding that dyslexia and dysgraphia and dyscalculia are very, very common with ADHD as well.
Yes, we are the poor cousin of and part of my book talks about that, this imbalance of financial support for dyslexics. I mean, just getting an assessment, you know, it's so hard just to get an assessment through an ed psych, which is why we're seeing so many adults come through, particularly our program now. But the only funding we have found that's available is Job Access, which is the program we deliver. And, you know, that gives you some one-on-one support, some workplace training and some accommodations, which is amazing because we don't have anything else. No. We're not under NDIS. There's no Senate inquiry. There's no, even though we know there's higher rates of people incarcerated with dyslexia, all the neurodivergence, but dyslexia particularly in New Zealand, you know, 50% of people incarcerated are dyslexic. And yet there doesn't seem to be the national education and literacy of human rights, they're basic human rights. You know, we can't function in society without literacy and numeracy skills, yet we are the least funded from an adult perspective. There's a lot that's gone into children, but there's more of a debate around phonics, whole language, you know, which is the best way to teach literacy skills. But we haven't been able to kind of shift into that next phase of we all grow up into adults, and then what does our quality of life look like?
Yeah.
And so, but it's great the national strategies come out and there's a Senate inquiry because we can start to push as a community around, well, we need this too. But I think we're quite fragmented, it appears, compared to the autistic community. You seem to be a bit more cohesive in the way you're doing things.
Yeah,
as an outsider.
It is interesting. Yeah, just like socially observing, you know, the differences in the different communities, and like, you know, every community I think has its own, what's the right word for it? The opposite of homogenous milk, but like heterogeneous, like diversity within the community.
Yes, there is a lot of diversity. Yeah, there is. There's huge diversity because we're all, depends on, you know, when we got diagnosed, interventions, you know, there's so many things that, you know, we've got a common thread in that we've got this label.
Yes, that's right. And it's interesting, I guess, within, the different community perspective, because even within the ADHD community, there's kind of like the very nature of ADHD can make it hard to organize and kind of follow through on things, and kind of, sometimes advocacy takes like a really, really long time, and it's really like a lot of hoops to jump through. And then in the autism community, there tends to be a lot of autistic parents of autistic children, and non-autistic parents of autistic children get into advocacy and social justice, and it can almost become their special interest. And I think that does help move things along, have a bit more, I suppose, organizing and getting stuff done. And I think that's just as a bit of an outside observation, maybe that's where actually all the different neurodivergent communities could maybe help each other, because we all have strengths, in our own different ways. And I think it's better to work together and make use of that rather than have all the communities as, siloed, done, and it's also acknowledging that a lot of the neurodivergencies really co-occur. Like, I'm not dyslexic, but I do have dyscalculia and really, really struggled with maths from basically grade 3 onwards. Yeah, that has definitely been a thread, in my picture, but maybe one that I don't talk about as much as autism and ADHD, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It's true. We should be having a neurodivergent strategy because it's most likely that someone hasn't had the opportunity to be diagnosed with more than one, because they, like the research is now telling us, you have more than one. It's very rare to have just one difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it would be much more strategic. Even though we need different types of support, there is still some supports that will be similar. And, instead of siloing us, if we could come together, that would be life-changing for so many of us.
Yeah, because it is often intersectional, often people have more than one thing going on and more than one thing they need support with. And because everything's so siloed, the supports are just for one thing and don't take into account all the other stuff, that can then make it a bit more complex to get support.
Do you feel like the neurodivergent movement, though, can water it down? If you see the umbrella, I can't remember who created the umbrella image, but they've got all the neurodevelopmental conditions and they've got all the mental health conditions, and there's like 15 or so, someone with an intellectual disability is now under that umbrella, someone with Down syndrome. So now all of a sudden we're under this big cohort. And I wonder if, even though a national strategy would be amazing to have our voices heard, it's like, how do you ensure, though, that our differences are still supported properly? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. It can be challenging, and I guess it's interesting because the neurodivergent umbrella offers a bit of an alternative to the psychiatry movement and things as purely like mental health. Because, for example, historically, autism was initially labeled similar to schizophrenia. Okay, or catatonia, and ADHD was seen as a behavioral disorder or low morality. You have poor morals, or you're lazy, or you just need to calm down. It's a mental health condition. And ADHD wasn't actually moved into the neurodevelopmental category until 2013 in the DSM-5. Before that was behavioral. So, yeah, I do think the neurodivergent umbrella and the neurodiversity model, it's aiming to kind of take away, I think, some of the stigma and the labeling of things as mental health, and looking at what is neurological, what's genetic, what are you kind of born with. That's a difference. But then there is ongoing debate about what comes under that. And so there could be acquired neurodivergence. Someone could maybe have an acquired brain injury, and now they are neurodivergent. Their brain is different. It's about things like complex trauma changing the brain and things like that. So it's kind of like people trying to make sense of, through language, what categories do we belong into? Like, what's disability? What's mental health? What's neurodivergence? What's considered like mental health? You know, are you neurodivergent if you have, you know, treatment-resistant depression, but you have episodes that come and go, you know? Or is it more that you're neurodivergent if, you know, again, it's an inborn neurological difference that's genetic? So I'm kind of open-minded to kind of hearing where the debate goes and hearing people's opinions, because I do think it's still happening and still forming. Like, the movement isn't finished, if that makes sense. It's still evolving, but I tend to focus more on, like, is it genetic? Is it neurological based? Is it lifelong, neurodevelopmental, like the course of your development? Because that's the lens that I've been trained in. So things like schizophrenia would fall under that because it is genetic. It is often lifelong once, you know, you assess. Bipolar for me would be brought under neurodivergence because, again, it's like a lifelong neurological difference. It is largely genetic. OCD might fall under that. Autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, tics, Tourette's. Whereas there might be other people that might go, no, OCD is an anxiety disorder, and you have an episode of it and then it, you know, goes into remission and then you don't have it anymore. Personally haven't really seen in practice. So yeah, I think there's room for debate and hearing each other. But yeah, we do want to be careful about not going down the pathway of not acknowledging the struggles, not acknowledging that it's hard having a different brain, you know, that it costs us more, not going into kind of making light of the very real things that people are dealing with day to day, if that makes sense, through trying to be positive about it.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a really great explanation of neurodivergence. And I think, you know, we've been led to believe because it came out of neurodiversity that it's all about strength-based, which it is. But I think being able to explain it in that way, that we're talking about differences that you're born with that are most likely genetic,
yes,
that they are lifelong. Like, I think that gives a much better context to why we're umbrellaing
yes,
a variety of conditions rather than, you know, where it came out of the neurodiversity conversation originally. And so I think that's just helped me immensely contextualize it a lot more as well. So thank you. I knew I'd learn a lot today from having this conversation with you. Awesome. Look, there's so many other questions I think I could ask you, but I wonder if that's a good point for us to stop and then potentially have a follow-up conversation, because I'd love to unpack a bit more about, you know, your childhood and those experiences for you. And, you know, some people when they're diagnosed in adulthood find a revelation. Some people, you know, can be catatonic for them. Yeah. Like, it's really, there's like lots of different experiences for people. And it's really great to be able to share those. And I think your journey about being able to reflect on your childhood as well will be really helpful for people. Is there anything for now, because I hope that this is not our last conversation, you would like to wrap up with for today?
Let me have a think, because, yeah, there's just so many different threads that you can go down, which is what I love.
We've covered a lot
about these conversations.
We've covered so many.
Yeah. And again, you know, could definitely go on and on for hours, but yeah, I think what
was the term you used at the beginning?
Info dump.
Info dump?
Info dump, yeah. Yep. It's so fun. It definitely gives me so autistic fun. Joy, like being able to info dump about my special interests. Yeah. So thank you for listening.
Well, we're very lucky that you have taken a special interest into this, because, you know, there's not enough stuff around adulthood and the co-occurring, and so to be able to have these open conversations and to listen and learn is just a real pleasure. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And I can't think of anything else to say right now, but I'm sure it will pop up for me at 2 a.m. tonight when I'm trying to sleep.
Oh, well, before we go, I really want to give a plug to your resource. People will be able to watch this on YouTube.
Awesome.
The Neurodivergent Skills Workbook for Autism and ADHD. We refer to this book continuously in our work with our autistic ADHD clients, and also, which isn't here, by Sonia Jane Wise. Oh, no, Christine Nerf.
Yes.
Her book on self-care, which is a really great resource as well. But we'll put all of those up on the website, including all of the amazing stuff Monique's done and her podcast as well, which has hit 2.5 million downloads, which is just awesome. So congratulations on all the amazing work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you haven't done so already, make sure you sign up to our mailing list so you can keep up to date with everything we are doing at Rethink Dyslexia. So head to rethinkdyslexia.com.au. And don't forget, if there's anything you heard today that was distressing, you can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Thanks for listening and bye for now.
Oh, yeah.